Professor, and welcome to Games as Lit 101. There are a whole lot of ways to let a player alter the story of a video game. We've seen enormous space operas that give the player many opportunities to make major decisions, high school dramas that put the player in a variety of different situations to react as they see fit, old school platformers that require 100% completion to actually accomplish the best ending, and even adding a whole endgame sequence depending on whether the player wears a specific amulet to the final boss battle. That one only made a little more sense in context. So today we're getting back to the recurring episodes where I dissect the implementation of player choice in a specific game. In this case, a little game called Cave Story. Cave Story was originally created in 2004 by Daisuke Amaya, also known as Pixel, and released for free on the PC. Its retro visual style, excellent chiptune soundtrack, and engaging Metroidvania gameplay slowly caught on, and since then, it's been re-released on a variety of platforms. The story isn't Shakespearean or anything, but it is quite enjoyable and surprisingly deep for the game's genre, and as you've probably caught on, it has a few different endings. So let's take a look. I'll try to keep spoilers to a minimum, but I am talking about some of the pivotal moments of player choice in the game, so there will be spoilers ahead, you've been warned. If you'd prefer to play the game first, the original version is still free, and I'll have a link to that in the description, and you can of course purchase the remasters at a variety of locations. Cave Story follows a robot who wakes up with no memories on a floating island among a group of rabbit-like people called the Mimiga, who have been oppressed by a doctor who's determined to experiment on them and gain some kind of power held within the island. Your first goal is simply to get off the island, but you become embroiled in the struggle between the doctor and the Mimiga. Now, most games that include choices that alter the story will present them rather plainly. They want to make it very clear that you're making a choice that will have consequences later on, so they tend to stop the action, or at least slow it down in order to pose to you a clear question and allow you to choose which option you're going to go with. Some games, however, try to approach choice a little more naturally by simply having the story branch as you play depending on what you do without calling attention to the fact that any choice is being made or the story is branching at all. Metro 2033 did this by having a few minor choices with no attention called to them that would alter the outcome of the story, like giving money to a poor child. And a number of games have made branching story paths depending on how well you accomplish the mission objectives in certain segments, like Star Fox 64, the Colony Wars games, which I'm pretty sure no one actually remembers, and even Call of Duty Black Ops 2. That one threw me a bit, I admit. I'm not used to narrative ambition in modern Call of Duty games. Anyway, Cave Story goes for this latter approach by and large, and the results are, well, kind of mixed, but that's what makes it interesting to talk about. So let's take a look at how it implements this type of player choice. There are 4 major points in Cave Story where the narrative branches, so we'll just cover them in order. The first is, unfortunately, also the worst of them. You're navigating a labyrinth when you see a fairly important character fall past your screen. Now, if you're thinking of this as a moral choice, it's rather obvious that you should help your friend, right? But actually, if you go down and talk to him, he gives you an incomplete item that won't let you get to the best ending, and then dies. Whereas if you ignore him entirely and keep going, he survives anyway and gives you the better item later on. This makes no sense whatsoever, at least until you look at it through a purely logical lens. The jump you have to make over the gap he falls down can be a fairly difficult one, with that lip right above where you're trying to get to, and if you fall down there, you can't get back up without the booster pack. In other words, if you fail a platforming challenge, you're locked out of the best ending. This, in and of itself, wouldn't necessarily be a problem. Some of the games I mentioned earlier also base the branching storylines on player skill, and it works great for them, but the narrative context completely confuses the issue. It comes across as entirely tone-deaf to the story, presenting you with a narrative context that suggests one course of action, despite ultimately having nothing to do with the story. Rather than working as a branching narrative point, it ends up having both gameplay and narrative significance that completely contradict each other. Anyway, the next choice is whether you save Curly Brace. The room you're in fills with water, and the other robot working with you gives you her bubble ability so you can survive indefinitely underwater, effectively sacrificing herself to save you. You have a choice at this point to leave her there or take her with you. Now, this is the perfect opportunity for this type of choice, because if it was presented more traditionally, the game would stop and ask you, do you want to save the life of this character who just saved your life at great risk to herself? And the obvious answer to that is yes. Unless you're trying to be a jerk, I suppose, but seriously. So this scenario changes the question at hand. It's not about whether you'll choose to do the right thing, but whether you're clever and observant enough to pull it off. Which is, in concept, the perfect way to deliver this choice at this point in the story, but in practice, it falls a little flat. See, the only way to take Curly with you is to have the tow rope, an item found hidden in the corner of the room where all this takes place. Problem is, you have to get it before the boss fight, by exploring the room and finding it before talking to Curly to initiate the fight. Aside from the fact that there's no reason to think you need to explore an obvious boss room before the fight, there's not really any reason to expect this kind of interaction will even matter in the first place. Video games are computer programs, which means there's always a finite amount of things that you can do. So most games will have a fairly simple set of interactions, generally kind of clustered around the core mechanics of the game. In this case, movement, shooting, and kind of inventory management. And then aside from that, some games will have a single interact button to cover all other types of less important, less commonly used interactions. So any given game has to set the expectations for how you'll be able to interact with the world around you, and Cave Story is a retro jumpy shooty action game. There's very little reason to expect that you'll be able to do much other than jump, shoot, and talk to people, and even less reason to expect you should be searching for usable items before talking to Curly when you enter the room. This choice more closely resembles an adventure game, and with no indication that the game is going to function like this, it's so easy for the player to just move on without realizing they even have the options they do. So it's a good situation for this style of choice, but not really the best delivery. You also need to undertake a questline after all this to actually nurse her back to health, and it works perfectly fine. The player can intuitively understand why this is important to do, so it sidesteps the problem that makes the initial segment such an issue. I need to just pause here really quick and make it clear the Cave Story is an excellent game that you should all play, and none of these mistakes really make it any less worth playing. I'm coming across as kind of negative about it since I'm talking about these story branches, but it just dropped the ball a few times in this area, but it is a genuinely good game, and thankfully, the last two choices are handled much, much better. The next one is whether you abandon your quest and escape the island with this guy, and it's the only choice in the game that presents itself as a more standard yes or no branching point. It's arguably a little pointless since it's literally asking whether you want to end the game now or keep playing for a better ending, but it fits with the character and story, so it's perfectly fine for what it is. Thankfully, the last choice is far simpler and more fluid than the others. As you're escaping, there's a door, and you can choose to go through it instead of continuing to theoretical safety. The simplicity of this choice is actually what makes it work for this game. It's not a meaningful narrative decision, just an alternative action that rewards exploration and the presence of mind to realize that not everything in the story is resolved yet. For the kinds of naturally integrated branching story paths the game is trying to create, this ends up being the best of the game's offerings. The unfortunate thing about how Cave Story approaches choice is how it doesn't quite succeed at setting up natural branches in the story based on how you play and what you do. Many elements of the process end up feeling kind of arbitrary and random because two of the major branching points don't gel well with the game's story or established interactive style. It doesn't mean the game is bad, on the contrary, it's quite possibly one of the best of its genre, but it does mean that we can look at its shortcomings in this area in order to better understand how to implement this style of choice in other games. And personally, this is a type of branching narrative that I would really enjoy seeing become more common and more refined as the medium continues to grow. Thanks for joining me for this look into Cave Story's branching narrative. If you agree, disagree, or wish this was a full analysis of Cave Story instead of just a little episode about one part of it, then feel free to talk about it in the comments. And if you liked the video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and check the description for links to Games as Lit 101 on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. Next time, we'll be talking about how The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild abandons the series' usual structure in favor of letting you set the pace, and how that actually somehow works. And don't forget my upcoming analysis of Alan Wake. So, until next time, class dismissed.